One of the questions that I get asked most is how to come up with arguments. And so the goal of this video is to help you kind of come up with ways to come up with arguments and come up with things to say in debates and to compare your arguments. And so the first question, how to come up with arguments, I always say first, ground it in your evidence. So what does your evidence say about your claim? Why is your claim to believe to be true? What is it? Why should I believe that evidence and like how it works? So the more that you can explain your evidence and understand that and help the judge understand that, that'll help you make arguments. So why should I believe your data or whatever it is to make your argument in a debate? The next thing then is to use your own knowledge. So the more that you know about the topic, the more hopefully you've heard smart people come up say things about the topic. You can like then kind of channel those into your debate. So use your knowledge of the content to sort of like make arguments and like point out flaws or make connections, etc. The third one is to use common sense or logic. So just like what makes sense to you. So if this is true, then what about that? Or, do that and kind of put all of that together so that what your evidence says, what your knowledge of the topic says, what common sense says, to do what the last step is called the spin. Like, oftentimes in debates, your evidence isn't going to make the exact argument that you want, or their evidence isn't, or you're not going to know the exact answer. But debate is about taking all of the possible things that you have and putting it together to make the best argument that you can, which is to try to make a compelling story for why you should believe what's true, given the materials that you have in the debate. So the next one is, how do you refute your opponent's arguments? Well, obviously, again, the most important one is just knowing about the topic. So, they say this, hopefully you've read some articles or some evidence or some, materials that respond to that argument already. But the most basic one is to point out differences between your point and your opponent's point and use those differences as the basis of your refutation. So if they introduce evidence, say, in a debate about immigration that says increased immigration lowers the wages of workers, and your position says that it would actually raise wages of workers, you might point out that we have a difference about the effect on wages. And now let me point out why I believe that my conclusion about wages is true. So in that instance, you're refuting their argument by pointing out the difference in the beliefs that you have on that position. Another one might be to question the argument. So ask questions about that argument and then use those questions as the basis of sort of having a debate. So someone might say, perhaps, that Hillary Clinton lost the last election because she didn't spend enough time in certain states. And then someone might say, okay, well, that makes sense, but what about all these other reasons that she lost the election? So, for example, she didn't stick to economic messaging, or that she already had sort of like low approval ratings, or wasn't a likable candidate, or these other things. And then now that you've asked this question, turn those questions into arguments to be like, your argument that, Hillary lost the election because of this reason, she didn't go to these, Rust Belt states, is wrong because all of these other factors contributed to her loss in the election, right? So you start out with a question, well, what about this? And then turn that question into an argument. The next one is to look at their evidence. So look at their evidence. Point out the flaws in it. Is it, not very good, or not written really well, or doesn't present a clear reason, or the strength of the evidence is not very strong, or the source is dubious, and then point that out and say that's a reason to not believe the argument. The next one is to question whatever they have cited as evidence, why that evidence supports the overall claim that they want to make. What other conclusions could we draw from that evidence? Or why does that evidence don't point us to the conclusion that they want? And the last one is you got to get out there and research. People are going to research and make arguments. You got to go find out what experts in the field say about those issues as well. And that is sort of the fun of debate, is like figuring it out and then coming up with a better strategy. The last one is how to compare arguments. So the first one, compare the qualifications of your authors. So if your author is, a professor from Yale and theirs is, a blogger on some, not really well accredited website, point that out. Believe our argument is from a more qualified source. The next one is recency. So oftentimes, like, more recent evidence on a subject is better because it sort of accounts for like whatever the newest developments are and might, have a better understanding of all the scholarship on a particular issue. But there's some issues where recency doesn't matter as much. So, if you think that your source is more recent, and then that's an important reason for whatever the issue is, you might point that out and then say, in the case of a debate about the strength of the economy, we should prefer evidence from the last month because that's where the most recent job and other economic indicators have come out. The next one is the source type. So some sources are better than others. So a news source is definitely better than an internet blog, but like an academic journal is much better than a news source. And different kinds of news sources are better than one another. And different kinds of academic journals are better than one another. And a book may or may be better than most. So if you think that your source is of better quality, then you should point out why that source should be more credible. All right, sorry if you can hear my dogs just playing with each other in the background. And then the last one is the type of evidence. So, we talked about there's all sorts of different kinds of evidence in a debate. So you could have, a study, you could have, empirical data, you could have just a claim from an expert author. If you think the type of support that your evidence uses is better than your opponent's, you should point that out and explain why, and use that to compare the grounds of your arguments. So, I think people have problems in debates like after they get going, because they're just like, I don't know what to do to fill my time. This is how you fill up your time. You need to come up with arguments based on what you know about the subject, what they've said, what your evidence says. You need to refute your opponent's points using your evidence and attacking their evidence and pointing out the differences and why you're correct about those differences. And then the last one is you need to compare your arguments. And you need to talk about where your arguments are more believable and qualified. And if you can do all of these things, that will help put you in a position where you can win debates in the final rebuttals.